name is Patrick Deal. I'm the treasurer of the Tucson group Cokes Off Campus, which is sponsoring today's webinar, Are Public Universities Doomed? Cokes Off Campus has been focusing on the Koch instigated academic center at the University of Arizona here in our town. It's the Center for Philosophy of Freedom, informally the Freedom Center. And for some years now, it has been funded with taxpayer dollars by the state legislature, has accumulated about $9 million in its bank. We think that's not a good thing. It's basically a propaganda arm of the Republican Party here in Arizona. It is also responsible for a high school economics course and textbook, which it has pushed out into high schools here in Tucson, in Maricopa County, up around Phoenix, and also in Mexico. It has ambitions to extend its network internationally. Our campus has succeeded in getting this course and textbook discontinued in the largest public school district here in Tucson, the Tucson Unified School District. And we also got it stopped, at least temporarily, in the Amphi School District. We are concerned about indoctrination, obviously, of innocent high school students who do not know that the textbook is only pushing one view of economics. We are also concerned about the fact that this academic center is only one of over 300 in the country that the Koch network has started on campuses. This is a very powerful base for them to put out research that looks legitimate and academic, and which isn't, in our opinion. So these are areas where we've been focusing. We're also part of an Uncoke Arizona campaign. And in that campaign, and in other respects, we're affiliated with the national level group, Uncoke My Campus, which has been doing excellent research and organizing on the Koch issue all around the country. You will be hearing actually from the executive director of Uncoke My Campus later on in this webinar. And that's about my local group here. Our presenter tonight is Professor Benjamin Balthaser of Indiana University South Bend. So he's teaching at a public university. He has been actively researching and writing on the issue of public universities and their rather dire condition that they've been brought into by underfunding for decades. He's written about them in the Democratic Socialists of America's bi-monthly Democratic Left, and also in the American Association of University Professors Academe. The latter article is actually called The Necro-Liberal University, a rather provocative title, which has to do with what he thinks, and we agree, is the very mistaken choice, if you can call it that, by public universities and others to bring students back onto campus while the virus is very far from being controlled. So you'll find both articles, or links, at least links to them, on Cokes Off Campus's website. The URL is www.cokesoffcampus.org. You will see this URL again later on in the broadcast, or sorry, in the webinar. He's the secretary treasurer of his campus's American Association of University Professors chapter, and has been organizing a Midwest American Association of University Professors regional coalition. So you're about to hear from an activist for public universities who is very well informed on the issue. So learn and enjoy. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Patrick. Benjamin, are you able to begin?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I heard some of the introduction, so I'll just say a few brief words about myself, and then I'll start talking. So I associate professor of multi-ethnic literature at Indiana University South Bend. And my specialty is in modern American literature. And so everything I'm going to talk to you about tonight is stuff that I've learned or gathered as basically someone who's been organizing around higher education, public higher education, since I was a graduate student. I'm the secretary treasurer of my AAUP chapter on campus, and we've been fighting since I've been there for the last decade, for a more accessible and democratic and faculty and student governed university. And so And I say this partially because I want to sort of locate myself as an activist, but also because when we get into the discussion after this talk, I'm not an expert necessarily in public policy. So if we want to have a discussion or collective discussion, I think that's probably as useful, perhaps, as me answering questions, although I'm certainly happy to answer questions. And I've been, of course, been reading about this stuff for the last couple of decades and figuring out practical ways to fight again for a more democratic campus. I like to start my talk off by relating a conversation that was told to me by a colleague with their dean. And they were talking about the reopening of campus in the fall, and they're having a discussion of whether they're going to be online or whether they're going to be on campus. And the dean started talking about whether or not, how many people are going to be okay or not okay. And my colleague was, well, what do you mean by okay or not okay? And the dean kind of trailed off. And my colleague wondered, what I think the dean really meant is, what's the acceptable death rate for campus when we all come back in the fall, given the pandemic, and whether in a cost-benefit analysis, how many students and or faculty can succumb to COVID before it's economically viable to be online. And while that's horrifying on the face of it, and like I said, you could just think of enormous kinds of invective one could have against administrators who think this way. It occurred to me to think about how do we get to a public university, this is at a public university, where administrators who have PhDs in public policy, the dean has a PhD in public policy, are calmly thinking about how many faculty can get sick and staff can get sick so they can keep the university running. And so part of the context, of course, that the dean is thinking about as she was talking about this was that we're in a moment where if the students don't come back to university and the state cuts us any further, there's going to be incredibly serious layoffs. Universities may even start to close. So University of Akron has cut 178 positions. The UC system has laid off about 500. UMass has laid off about 500. The CSU has had a $300 million cut. University of Arizona has had 250 faculty position cuts. University of Vermont system was actually threatened with entire closure. Every single campus except for the flagship campus was threatened with closure. And of course, this is every university in America right now is facing cuts, layoffs, and possibly even shutting their doors. And this is on top of years and years of cuts already. And so the question is, how did we get to this place where a pandemic can threaten to shut down entire American universities unless university administrators invite students back to campus when it is clearly not safe? And if anybody has not been paying attention to the news, universities have now become major hotspots for COVID. And of course, faculty such as myself have been telling university administrators this for months, that if you reopen, this is exactly what's going to happen. And in a lot of places, this is exactly what has happened. And so the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this barbaric and bizarre situation, which, as Patrick suggested, I've been calling the necro-liberal university. And the first thing we have to say as a question about how we got here is where we were to begin with. And I'll elaborate a little more on this as we go along. But I think the first thing to remember is that the United States witnessed perhaps the largest public university expansion in American history. This is according to the research by Chris Newfield, which I encourage you all to read. That the US basically had one of the finest public university systems, most accessible, lowest cost, enrolled the most members, pretty much in the entire world. And post-World War II, it really saw this really historic expansion. And as Chris Newfield articulates, he calls it a mass quality, or called it a mass quality education. It was not a crap education. It was not the McDonald's version of higher education. It was actually good education. In most places, it was free. And in most universities, it not only was free for students, Bernie Sanders was often thought of as being quite radical for proposing free education. And it's a free education that people used to experience as just basically a right of being American. So my mother, of course, went to UCLA in the 1960s as a working class first generation college student and paid exactly $25 in the entire 4 years. So we went from having this mass quality education that was accessible and affordable and expanding, expanding not only in terms of numbers, but expanding in terms of its diversity, in terms of its course offerings, and becoming actually more democratic through the 1960s, to now being a situation in which about 25% of the budget has been stripped from public universities nationwide since the 1990s. And I think it's really important to say that while we're in a general situation and have been in a general situation of austerity in most public institutions, there really is no other public institution that's been cut in the same way. So K through 12 has been privatized. The charter school system has threatened a lot of K through 12 classrooms, and has been an attempt, of course, to break teachers' unions. But if you actually look at the budgets for K through 12 education, they've actually been increasing rather than decreasing. And the same is true for a lot of other kinds of programs that have faced a sort of austerity budgets, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, whether it's, again, K through 12 education or Social Security. These programs actually, in terms of the dollar amounts, have been expanding, even as actually their provisions have become more privatized. But higher education is the only institution, one of the few institutions that's been experiencing both. So it's been privatized, but it's also, just in terms of the actual money that's being spent on it, is radically cut, and radically cut really across the country. And I can get into a lot of the sort of theories. I'll get into a lot of sort of theories and hows and whys of this, but I think it's also a story we just need to look at through the numbers as we go along. And so I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint slide that has just a number of sort of statistics about kind of where we are in public university spending and where we are in terms of public university budgets. So the first slide I'd like you to look at is a percent drop in funding per student just since 2008. And I think one important thing to mention is that these cuts have been going on really since the 80s. They intensified during the 90s. But even since the Great Recession, there's been a further intensification. So $9 billion nationwide has been cut from higher education just since the Great Recession. And so if you look at per funding student drop since 2008, you can see that in many states, it's up to half of the total funding has been slashed from higher education. This, by the way, is again from research done by Chris Newfield, who has had two really excellent books on higher education that I very much encourage you to check out. So Arizona, the home state of University of Arizona and ASU, has been cut the worst, but if you go down the list, it's all pretty bad. So Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama, and the only states that have seen any increase basically are states that have had windfall profits from the oil boom, which has now also gone bust. So we can expect these states to start cutting as well. The other way to look at this number is to look at percent increases in tuition since 2008. And probably the number that people are most familiar with in terms of higher education privatization and budget cutting is that it just simply costs more. And it's a very interesting thing that whenever I hear a story at NPR or PBS, relatively liberal news outlets, and they'll talk about the increased cost of higher education, they'll frequently talk about administrative salaries and pools and climbing walls and dormitories. They very seldomly talk about the fact that universities just don't have as much money as they used to because the state appropriation has been slashed dramatically. And that's really the main driver. There's many other drivers, and I'll talk about many other drivers that are part of it, but the main story is just the budgets have been slashed. And so if you notice, the same systems that have had their budgets slashed the most are also the systems that had the largest increases. So Arizona is in the top of both lists, but the numbers are appalling all the way down the list. And so you can see here, basically, another way to look at this number is by looking at state funding and tuition. So you can see as state funding has dropped, tuition has increased. And the tuition has gone up a little bit more than the state funding, but basically that's the story. They're inverted lines, right? And if anyway, so if you get nothing else from this talk, if you ever get in a conversation about why public universities are in crisis, they're in crisis because people keep cutting their budgets. They keep cutting their budgets for a lot of different reasons, which we'll get into. The other way to look at this as well is consumer costs of higher education in relation to other cost increases. People talk a lot about medical budgets or medical costs going up dramatically, and it's true, medical costs are going up dramatically, but it's nothing compared to the cost of higher education. Higher education costs have been ballooning, even in relationship to medical costs, which, like I said, are the number one reason for bankruptcy in America, private bankruptcy in America. And I think that's soon going to be eclipsed probably by higher education. So we've seen a 1,120% increase in cost just in the last 12, 15 years. But since higher education used to be free, there's actually no numerical value you can put to it. It's just gone from something that was free for most people to something you actually have to pay an enormous amount of money for. Of course, the other number, and sorry, I don't mean to drown you in numbers, but I think it's just, before we get into the hows and whys, it's really important just to look at the numerical scope of this crisis. The other way to think about what's happened as a result of this budget cutting has been student loan debt. So the student loan debt total is $1.4 trillion, which is, of course, more than the annual revenues for many countries in the world. And the average number of student loan debt per person is $30,000. And if you look at this chart, pretty much every student who now graduates has some amount of debt. That's become almost universal. In fact, it's one of the few universal things all college students can enjoy is debt. Another way to think about this number too, and this is actually what's really scary, is that so many students have maxed out their student loan debt that actually parents are starting to take on student loan debt. And so there's something like 10 to 15% of parents that actually have as much loan debt as their children. And so the average student loan debt of $30,000 does not actually count the loan debt of their parents, which is frequently about the same amount, around $30,000, a little bit less. So this is the main story I think people have probably heard the most about. The college costs are going up, and student loan debt as a result is going up because students are borrowing to pay for these large fees. The other story that's been almost as widely covered, but well, actually, no, I wouldn't say as wide. I hear about it all the time because I'm in academia, but actually a lot of my students don't know this. And I frequently have to tell them that most of the faculty who teach them not only are not tenured, but actually make less an hour than they do at their waiters jobs. And so the story of higher education in the public and private, but mostly in the public, well, actually both, public and private, has been the evisceration of tenure. So from 1975, basically 2/3 of faculty were tenured or at least full-time. And it's basically reversed now. So one of the ways that universities have cut their costs, not only has been to squeeze students, but also to squeeze faculty. Sometimes you hear in particularly right-wing news channels that the other thing driving up higher education costs are faculty salaries. And I can tell you, outside of a few schools like business, that is not the case. Faculty salaries are actually quite low. And as a total, 14% of faculty pay has been cut since the 1980s. So faculty are making 14% on average less. But the real number is actually in terms of tenure versus non-tenure. So basically, universities used to be mostly tenure. So if you went to a university in the 70s or even up to the 80s, chances are most of your classes will be taught by a tenured or tenure track faculty, which that basically means that after a period of 5 or 6 years of review, the faculty member has academic freedom protections, and they also can't be fired without due process. So what this allows, of course, professors is to pursue their research and their teaching as they see fit in their disciplines, rather than be worried about, so student evaluations or a bad boss one year. So the idea basically is the university is a place where faculty and students can pursue questions without fear of being fired. And now basically 70% of instruction is done by non-tenure track faculty and 30% is done by tenure track faculty. And so when people talk about academic freedom on campus and the cancel culture, one of the things that always drives me crazy is that no one actually talks about the fact that most faculty actually have no academic freedom protections whatsoever. And this is actually the most material concern that worries most faculty. This also depends a lot on the institution you're at. So another way of looking at that, these are AAUP statistics. If you want to look at this more, the American Association of University Professors has done an enormous amount of research on this question. So this is worst at an R1 institution, so a research university like a Berkeley or University of Arizona or University of Minnesota are large public research universities. They employ the most casualized faculty labor, but it's pretty much true across the board. The other part of this, this is the number that I am obsessed about, which is what's happened to university staffing. It used to be that faculty ran their own institutions. There's this notion of faculty governance, that faculty are supposed to be in control of the curriculum, and they're supposed to be in control of basically, how universities operate. And there's been an increasingly macabre statistic that universities actually now employ more administrators than they employ faculty. And this is increasingly true at every institution. It's particularly true at research institutions, but it's pretty much true wherever you go. And this is a list of basically the University of California. And the reason is actually fairly simple. It's not, you could say it's, Bavarian bureaucracy reproducing itself, and there's some of that. But a lot of it is, if you're privatized and you're no longer getting money from the public sector, you're basically getting money from a lot of private grants, donations, and foundations, like the Koch network, for instance, and that requires a lot of administrators to manage that money. And so now you have a situation in which basically universities are money managers. They have, even public universities are money managers. They have to manage money from a number of different private sources in order to survive. And so universities are more concerned about managing money than they are actually teaching students. And you can see that, again, just in the growth of administration. And so what Chris, what Chris Newfield describes as budgets decline and private donations increase, and tuition increases and student debt increases and faculty become increasingly casualized, he talks about what he calls the devolutionary cycle of privatization. That is, once you start budget cutting, there's basically no end to it. So for instance, you start cutting the budget, and then you start having to get private donations. And then the mission of the university starts changing from being a public institution to a largely privatized institution. You start increasing student loan debt, and so students start understanding their role on campus in a very different kind of way. The university starts selling off large parts of the university to private vendors. Say, for instance, Coca-Cola and Pepsi now have private concessions at my university. Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble run the bookstore at my university. Instead of having public vendors for food and coffee, it's all been privatized. The gym has been privatized. The internet has been privatized. Zoom, of course, is a huge beneficiary. And universities are doing this. These things they used to do themselves in-house, which actually was far less expensive. They're doing it because they have to basically raise money. And so it creates this sort of cycle in which universities, once they start privatizing and once legislators start cutting them, they basically go in the cycle where they become even more private and even more spare and even more austere. And I think the way to understand this is that on some level it's been by design. This is not simply careless and casual legislators doing this because they're mean or they hate universities. Some of them do, and we'll get into the ones who do, but or they've just been sloppy. I actually remember this professor I had. He was a Marxist economist. I took a class with him when I was a master's student, and he said, with great exasperation, I don't understand, everyone says education is this thing that we're all supposed to support. We all think it's this benefit, this public good. And yet the one thing that it seems Democrats and Republicans can agree on alike is that it should be cut. And he said, look back on this, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, and wonder how this happened. And the thing, though, is that there's actually a lot of reasons why this happened. This was not simply, he seemed to think it was some grand mistake or grand accident. In fact, the title of Chris Newfield's book is called The Great Mistake. And I want to propose that it was not a mistake at all. And the way to understand why universities have been such of the crosshairs is that the public university in the 1960s and 1970s was perhaps the most egalitarian institution in America, which sounds kind of strange because universities are thought of as actually being often quite elitist. And there's a lot of status distinctions at universities, but the university of the 60s and 70s, particularly the public university of the 60s or 70s, was probably the most egalitarian and equal institution in America. If you thought about just faculty salary versus administration salary, yes, administrators used to, have always made more than faculty, but it might have been 2 times or 3 times the amount that a tenured faculty would make. But that's basically Soviet Union level wage distinctions. You could think of universities almost as little Soviets. That basically they're places in which faculty and administration almost make the same amount of money. The faculty had massive amounts of power to basically hire and fire their own ranks. There are very few other institutions in which the workers hire each other, right? So universities were the few places where the workers in the institution, the main workers in the institution, actually hired each other and fired each other. Yes, administrators had a role, but pretty much faculty governed hiring and firing. And of course, many of the faculty had, if not exactly jobs for life, at least had could only be fired by for basically through due process. And also most of the employees were unionized. One of the things we also forget is that universities, particularly public universities, are often wall-to-wall union. And so both of the universities that I went to as students, actually all of the universities I went to as a student, University of Washington, San Francisco State, University of California, San Diego, and UMass Amherst, basically were union top to bottom. I think one of them, the faculty weren't unionized, but at least there was an AAUP chapter. But the janitors were unionized, the food service workers were unionized, the house cleaners were unionized. And so you can think about universities as basically being these relatively egalitarian places that also offered free, not crap education, free, very high quality education. And so when the student movements exploded in the 1960s, oftentimes these student movements were very hostile to the administrators. But another way you could think about what happened was that the student movements themselves actually understood very well what kind of institution they were at. They understood they were at these egalitarian institutions that were sort of quasi-democratic, and they wanted to push that democracy even further. As Chris Newfield mentions in his book, The Unmaking of Public University, he starts with this really wonderful example of the founding of the Ethnic Studies program at UC San Diego, where I got my PhD. And he said, you know, as much as the founding of the Ethnic Studies program, UC San Diego was seen as quite oppositional to the administration, the students understood very well that the public university is supposed to be a democratic place. And if California is to be democratic, then it needs an ethnic studies program that represents, you know, the diversity, the rich diversity of California. And they saw the university as a place to represent that democracy. And I think, like I said, they understood the democratic potential of the university oftentimes better than the university administrators themselves, and sometimes I would say my own colleagues. And I think one thing to say about privatization is that privatization is not just about budget cutting. And like I said, I think you can see this very clearly in a lot of institutions that have been privatized in which the revenues actually explode, is that privatization is part of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is a logic of governance. As you know, economists and geographers such as Wendy Brown and David Harvey have talked about, neoliberalism is not just about austerity budgets, it's about replacing public goods with private goods, right? It's making public institutions into institutions that are about private investors and private revenue, and also turning the workers in those institutions into people who are worried about their CVs and their personal careers, and turning the consumers or the students in this institution into consumers that think about their education as something that benefits them privately, but is not part of the public good. And if you think I'm making this up, I'll go to my next slide, which is Ronnie Reagan as governor of California in the 1970s. And Ronald Reagan, we think of Reagan, who, you know, is the Cold Warrior, the person who came to power fighting the Soviet Union, and or perhaps as the anti-communist from the 1950s, who, you know, was rooting out communists in Hollywood. But he really ran for governor. And as someone who's from California, and actually my mom, the first protest my mom went to was a protest against raising tuition at UCLA. People remember him in California as the person who ran against Berkeley, who ran against the student protesters, who ran against the student left. And so this is a picture of Ronald Reagan at an infamous press conference in Berkeley in 1969, after the protester James Rector was shot to death by the police during the People's Park protest. And instead of Reagan being contrite about this, Reagan came to this meeting full of faculty, and one of the faculty members said, you know, you can't run a university at bayonet. And Reagan basically said, watch me. He said that the only reason, I'm trying to remember the exact quote. It was basically, some of you professors who ought to know better, and some of you professors who are old enough to know better, think that it's okay to let students run amok in the name of social protest. In other words, if students are getting shot on campus, it's their fault. And I'm going to read this little part out loud because I think it's one part I want to get very clear. Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California by running against the UC, not the UC of high standards and low cost, but rather the Berkeley and UC San Diego of hippies and Black Power protesters. One of Reagan's first acts as governor was to introduce tuition to the once tuition-free University of California system. In a press conference 2 weeks after his tuition proposal, he stated that tuition would help, and he actually said this, he was very clear, tuition would help get rid of the undesirables, those there to agitate and not there to study. They might think twice if they pay tuition. They might think twice how much they want to carry a picket sign. In an influential document written at the same time, future Supreme Court Justice and advisor to Reagan, Lewis Powell, authored a memo in which he characterized higher education as not a means to democratize society and for class advancement for the lower middle class students, but rather as an epic struggle between social norms and radical student-faculty culture. As Henry Giroux writes, Powell warned of liberal professors and their agendas who were wielding enormous influence far out of proportion to their numbers, radicalizing their students to the point of being revolutionaries. Thus, from its inception, the neoliberal assault on higher education was never framed in California or elsewhere in the US for that matter as an assault on public services or an assault on education. Rather, the assault was on public higher education framed as an attempt to save it, paradoxically from the very people who it was designed to serve. So the very beginning of this kind of assault on higher education was never about, I'm going to, basically raise your tuition and put you into debt. The assault on the university was understood as basically an assault on hippie protesters and an assault basically on a university administration run amok with costs and expenses and sort of running this little Soviet and causing all kinds of social problems. And of course, you can see this discourse today with Donald Trump talking about Maoist professors in the re-education camps and these sort of evil Professor 101 lists. And you might laugh at this stuff, but this is stuff that actually people take quite seriously and has been the rationale for why cutting public education has been taken very seriously. And of course, this has now jumped on a bandwagon by liberals alike. But I think who talk about, they don't talk about, running malice off of campus. They mostly talk about bloated administrations. But I think the effect is rather the same. And I think you can think about this, whether it's done benignly, done dumbly, or done, I think, in a lot of cases, with a lot of actual hatred of the university and hatred of, particularly of the university as a public good. You can think about this as a changing relationship between the state and the public. And I think one of the examples that makes this the most clear, and again, I keep referring to California because I'm from California and I went to school in California, but also because I think California had the best funded public education system in the country and perhaps the best funded public education system in the world. And Berkeley was really the crown jewel of the public university system. But I also say not just Berkeley, the CSU. The CSU is really a top-rate public university system. I actually went to San Francisco State for a couple of years before transferring, and it was really a kind of a wonderful place. And this is in the 90s. We could still kind of affordable. And it was a place where I remember meeting the sons and daughters of Black Panthers in the Bay Area and having these wonderful conversations, the student quad. And it was basically, still in the 90s, it was expensive, but not of course what it is now. And you can see it's very, very clear in California, the money has literally gone, and I say this actually very literally, it has gone for two things. It's gone for tax cuts to the wealthy, and it has also gone to pay for prisons. So if you look at the prison to university ratio, in 1974, remember back, this is sort of the good old days of the university in some ways, basically, public university spending was twice prison spending. It was 20% for Cal State and 9% for UC, the total budget. And now it is basically the reverse. So despite the fact that the California population has doubled since 1975, and despite the fact that it's a far more complicated economy than the economy in 1975, university funding has basically remained flat, which essentially means that it's been cut in half because of the population, again, has doubled. And prison spending has gone up basically by a figure of 2. And so literally what you have is that at the very moment that the public university started enrolling through affirmative action programs, aggressively enrolling poor, working class, and students of color, at that very moment it started being cut. And many of those same students are not in universities, they're in prisons. And as one of my friends in ethnic studies quipped, no one has a problem when they destroyed affirmative action in California. No one seemed to have a problem with the affirmative action program in the prison system, which was overrepresenting people of color. Okay. Yes. So yeah, so I think one of the things I would really want to stress that when we talk about higher education is that it's now become, I would say, kind of this de-evolutionary cycle that it's sort of on autopilot. Legislators cut university budgets just because they've been cutting university budgets, and university administrators say it's okay to cut our budget because then we'll raise tuition. And university administrators actually kind of like it this way because when the funding is under their control, they actually have much more discretionary power over it, right? And so this is again kind of the administrative rise, the fall of the faculty. And I would also say follow the students as well, because actually there were proposals in the 1960s for having much more sort of collaborative relationships between faculty and students. One of the probably the most wonderful examples of this was again at UC San Diego. It was the third college, or Lumumba Zapata College, as it was informally known, in which students and faculty actually ran the college together. UC San Diego has this sort of Oxford system where you have a number of different sort of independently run colleges, and one of them was literally run by faculty and students together. And actually, Angela Davis was part of creating this program. And before I get to these wonderful slides of protest, I can't help another slide from UC San Diego. This is exactly what people like Reagan wanted to prevent. They wanted to prevent the kind of utopian promise that Angela Davis and her mentor Herbert Malcusa at San Diego were promoting. Basically, this idea that the public university is a public good and it's about creating a more democratic culture. And I think of this photograph. This photograph was from UC San Diego in the sort of literature. There's kind of a joint literature philosophy program that Marcuse and Davis were part of, and I think of this photograph in sort of almost like sort of sentimental terms, sort of bathed in golden light. Here you have this refugee from Nazi Germany in a mentee relationship with a refugee from Clan Birmingham, together basically thinking about how to make a more democratic university. And this, to me, that utopian promise of the university, is just smoke and embers at this point. But when I think about what the promise is, that's what I think it is. And even when I was a student, there's the reason why people still want to be grad students and still, when they go to a public university, think this is great and have transformative experiences, because I think people still see in the sort of nooks and crannies of the public university system, that promise is still there, right? But that promise is holding on by a thread. I would say it's not all doom and gloom. I do think there's, maybe hope is too strong. There's a lot of doom and gloom right now. There's a lot of reason to be pessimistic right now. But I will say I've seen some things that give me at least some reasons to continue organizing. And one of them was actually toward the end of my PhD program. Some of the largest protests I have ever seen for higher education. I've been organizing around higher ed since I was at UMass. UMass had a very militant grad student union that was very, it was actually one of the first ones, and I was very active in their proposals to fight budget cuts and restore funding of the university and fight tuition increases, et cetera. But the protests were usually relatively small and relatively well-mannered. We had a one-day walkout, I remember. But the protests in 2008, I mean, they were, in California, they were huge. I don't know if anyone was perhaps there, but I mean, they swept the entire state, every campus, the UC, CSU, even community colleges were part of them. I remember organizing in these coalitions with community college students, CSU students, and UC students and faculty, which had really never been done or hadn't been done in a very long time, because of course the administration likes to keep these populations separate. And they were saying people occupied buildings. They occupied buildings for weeks. There was actually people were lighting tires on fire, at the UCLA campus. And while they're incredibly explosive and actually rather violent, the police got rather violent with the students. And actually, that was repeated again during the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011. If you remember the pepper spray cop who pepper sprayed that line of students as though he was like, I don't know, watering his garden or something like that. It was a kind of surreal image. But one of the things that's important to remember, though, and it's often forgotten in the sort of extreme photographs, is that that was the first time in my memory that a budget cut was canceled. And while it did not save the university, and also tuition increases were canceled, it did not save the university, it was a sign that, yes, this kind of stuff works. And it was actually the first time Governor Brown, who was all about cutting higher education, Governor Brown was, while not as heinous perhaps as Schwarzenegger, who came after him, was all about cutting public higher education. He actually stopped in his tracks. And again, I'd never seen that before. And the other thing also too that's happened that's somewhat promising, Rutgers faculty have a really good union, and they were able to actually reverse a lot of the cuts that had recently been proposed by the state legislature. And not only reverse cuts, but reverse cuts to tenure lines, which also has not happened in a very long time. Like tenure lines actually are increasing rather than decreasing. So, like I said, it is possible to organize. And I think also I would say the Bernie Sanders campaign was a really key way. And am I getting a time finger? No, okay. All right. The Bernie Sanders campaign, I think, was really important. Whatever you think of electoral politics, was really important in the demand that it created, because his demand was not we need to fund poor students. His demand was not we need to increase tenure lines or worry about adjuncts and all. We need to do all those things. I had in my notes to talk about all the adjunct horror stories in my department. Literally, one of my colleagues calculated her pay at $3 an hour. But in any case, what was really important about Sanders' proposal was that it was very simple: free tuition. University is a public good. And people really respond to that, because I think if you talk about fighting for a university in these sort of dribs and drabs, right, helping this population or helping that population, people forget actually that the university is actually a public good. It's for all of us who want to go. And that it's actually a good thing for people to have. It's a good thing for society to have. And students, I think, and parents need to be sort of shocked out of the habit of thinking that university is something for themselves as a private benefit, to benefit themselves in a labor market, or perhaps it's good for this constituency or that constituency. I think what was really important about the Sanders campaign, and sort of like threw the lid off of it, is that it reminded us that, yes, we used to think of university in a country that doesn't have much in the name of the public good, that the university is one of those few public places where that actually really, for a brief moment, almost at least partially became imaginable as a reality, right? I mean, a lot of my colleagues will remind me that the university, even in its best moments, kind of sucked in a lot of ways, for a lot of people. But I would say, yes, that is all very true. However, you could see in the movements that were born by the university, the most radical elements recognize its utopian potential. And I think that utopian potential is born out of the material circumstances of its public character. And I think that's the thing we need to remember. Well, I'll end on one other story. Actually, it was my sole Twitter fight I've ever engaged in, and it was with someone who was talking about decolonizing the university, and I was just sort of asking what they meant by that phrase, and that person seemed to have a kind of a burn it all down approach to it. It's like, the university was born out of the Moral Act, the land grant institutions were born out of the theft of indigenous land, and therefore burn them all down. And I said, well, I understand why that might appeal to some people, but if you actually look at some of the proposals, like one university that actually has gotten this windfall profit from oil revenues, has actually engaged in this long process with tribal nations in the Dakotas about what actually decolonizing the university, using the funding of the university actually to think about ways of supporting tribal sovereignty and tribal education programs. And so I think the mode for me is not to say, oh, it's only been public for some, is how do we make it public for all? And that can only happen if the university is understood as a public good, right? So I'll end there on a note of utopian promise, but also great peril, and open up for questions or comments. So.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Yes, we're going to open up for Q&A, but before we do, briefly, I'm going to ask our collaborator, Jasmine Banks from Uncoke My Campus, to talk a little bit about Uncoke My Campus. Let me make sure. Jasmine, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I have. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. My name is Jasmine. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the executive director of Uncoke My Campus. I apologize that I missed the first 19 minutes we had. Like, our neighborhood had this weird outage and my internet was wild, which power outage in Arkansas, but we're in the Ozark Valley, so that can be impactful. So I apologize, and thank you for making space for me, Jeff. So what we do at Uncoke My Campus is exactly what you talked about during your presentation. We look at the ways in which the neoliberal college university has been leveraged by actors whose expressed intent is to use their money to leverage and capture influence and create this talent pipeline, whether it's through professors or students or culture production, that ultimately creates the material conditions, whether it's in policy, whether it's in political will, whether it's in legislation, or just in curriculum and pedagogy, that supposes that all of us should be on this free market individualistic journey of amassing as much wealth as we can. So maybe you too one day can be a billionaire just like the Koch brothers or Jeff Bezos. And we know that myth is one that is rooted in the neoliberalistic capitalistic frame. And we know it's a thing that doesn't suit the Black, brown, and indigenous people. As a queer Afro-Indigenous woman, the higher education has always been a beloved institution for me. I was the first of my family to graduate junior high and then high school and then undergraduate and then get a graduate degree. And so I definitely come to this work not romanticizing the violence that is inherent in the institution of public education. There's quite a bit of it, going back to its inception, like you talked about around Harvard, and how religion, and particularly like the Puritans, were involved in that. And as a Cherokee person, as a Black person who is a product of transatlantic slavery, I would say higher ed kind of gave our folks a run for their money, if I'm putting it lightly. But is there something to transform within higher education? And we believe yes. We believe that if you can address the undue donor influence, if you can return governance and power back to the faculty and students and the communities that these institutions are situated within, who they seek to serve, then we can engage a tactic of uncoking as a form of harm reduction to create an intersection that opens up transformation for colleges and universities. And then depending on where those universities and colleges are, their local ecosystem can create the model solutions that are appropriate, that are culturally appropriate and appropriate for the communities that they purport to serve. And so, yeah, that is sort of like the higher level work that Uncoke My Campus does. We are moving into a transition where we're no longer a fiscally sponsored project. We are going to become our own 501c3 called the Common Good Generation. And so Uncoke My Campus will situate inside the Common Good Generation. And the vision of the Common Good Generation is to transform and reimagine public institution or public education institutions. And we will remain, steadfast in targeting the Koch network. But if we're being intellectually honest, we know it's not just the Koch network who are engaging in these acts, right? It's the Waltons, it's Sinkefeld in Missouri. There are so many folks who understand that if they can leverage higher education with the resources, economic resources they've gotten on the backs of the labor of Black and brown folks, and then they can continue this extraction and commodification of our faculty and our students and our communities. And so we believe that like just like you said, that the university is the public good. It belongs to the people, and we Uncook My Campus is nationally here to have a presence to say we're no longer for sale, and we're going to overthrow your shareholders. So if you're calling up that utopian, like radical queer Black analysis, that's definitely where Uncook has been. It has not where we've always been, but it is where we are now. And we're thrilled to continue to do this work with Cooks off campus, as well as, partners in 30 other states, and on numerous campuses. So yeah, that's sort of my elevator pitch.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. We definitely appreciate all the support we are getting and collaboration that we're getting with Uncook My Campus here locally in Tucson and Arizona. I would like to open up the floor for questions, and we're going to take questions in chat. If people can type their questions, that would be ideal, and then I will read them out of chat. You can type them to me privately. You could type them to everybody. There aren't that many people here. There's about 16 of us. Okay, I'm going to start with Kat Ripley. Here in Tucson, Pima Community College was totally cut by the state. There is already movement afoot towards buying online, no-credit private companies and more effort at technical certifications at the expense of dangerously diluting humanities and arts. This is the opposite direction of movement towards free community college, which is arguably an easier path than free tuition for universities. Has COVID rung the death knell for community colleges? And to your points, administrators have enormously large salaries, while adjuncts, who make up the bulk of the faculty, will undergo a project they are calling unbundling the faculty role. Your thoughts, Benjamin?
Yeah, all that's true. One of the ironies, thank you for the comment. Yeah, there's a lot there. One of the ironies, it's funny, I've been, my colleagues and I in our AAUP chapter, our big fight before COVID was actually to stay offline. So the university administration was trying to push online education at our campus because it would basically be save on labor costs, right? You could have one online course, taught by an adjunct in the Poconos, and they'd be running many of these, and of course they could save a lot of money this way. And it was interesting that when COVID started and we said, well, actually now I want to be online, they immediately opposed us. And so why I want to puzzle out that irony is that it suggested that for us, the administration basically, and I think this is also the state legislature, can't, how can I put it? Things like online education and technical education, there's a speculation that they're going to somehow replace the university or shut down the university, or completely and totally destroy the humanities. What they want really is a university in which essentially the humanities and social sciences are run at as low cost as possible, and profits are siphoned off, and tuition dollars are siphoned off for basically places that can make the university money and work in sort of this goal of privatization. So like, for instance, one of the big moves at our campus is to move from basically being a liberal arts campus. We were this sort of small kind of liberal arts campus, and it turned us into a pharmacy school. And so it's basically been sort of the technification of public university across the country. And so I think what that will probably mean is that the further down the sort of university ladder you go, the more like a trade school it's going to look. And so if we're being turned, we're a public college, four-year college with master's programs, if we're being threatened with basically being turned into a trade school, I fear that what's going to happen to the community colleges is that they're going to be turned into something perhaps like, I don't know, a tech continuing school or something even, actually that's, yeah. So yeah, I think the threats are quite real. I do think though, the move, and this is perhaps just me, and you can disagree, but I think the move to sort of say we should have free public community college, but still have tuition at four-year colleges, it's understandable, and it's understandable certainly because a lot of Democratic politicians seem to be more agreeable to that proposal. But the problem with that is that it retreats away from this proposal that universities just need to be a public good. End of story. Once we start thinking of universities as being something that is for the private attainment of the students as a consumer good, then you start basically entering this proposition where each person is paying, and it's still true, actually going to public university is still a good bargain on some level in terms of your earnings for your entire life, and that's what they sell it with, right? So yes, you may incur $30,000 worth of debt, but you'll make so much more. And of course, that's a bad idea. It's a bad idea for a lot of different reasons. So once you start down the road that the university is a private good for citizens to increase their human resource potential, you've already opened the door basically for unlimited tuition cuts, unlimited privatization. And so, yeah, so obviously I think it's gonna be easier to sell the idea of a public community college because it's quote unquote serves poor students. But once we start thinking about tuition as simply a forgiveness for poor students rather than a public good for all, then you basically open this door for privatization. So it's a very long roundabout way of saying the move basically is to turn, I mean, people like Mitch Daniels are very clear about this. Like he basically came out and said, and he's now the president of Purdue. I was actually very curious why the governor of Indiana, who who's running for, seemed to have a good chance of becoming a pretty serious contender for the Republican nomination for president. People were talking about him running for senator. Why would he want to be the president of Purdue? And I think you have to think about it. It's like for the right, running the university is very important. It's part of their culture war, but it's also part of their business model. And Mitch Daniels was very clear. He said the university has, the public university has one role, which is basically to subsidize business, right? It's a sort of predator state model. So for him, Purdue is basically an engine for the economy where essentially it will use the state appropriation to kind of funnel that money back into private business, right? And that's sort of at the high end for Purdue, so funnel back into sort of high-end businesses. But for everyone else, it's basically trade schools, right? So we get a pharmacy school, and I think community college get a wood shop, and so I think on some level we're at the moment where the only practical solution is a utopian one in a way. This is, I think, the old slogan, socialism or barbarism, is very true in a lot of different places. We're either going to have a public university or we're not, and there really is no in between anymore. And so sorry again, that was a very long-winded roundabout explanation, but I think all these things are quite complicated.
Oh, so. Excellent answer. We have 3 more questions on deck, and I always bristle whenever I'm at a public sector queue or speaking to somebody who's representing a university or a public agency and they use the phrase customer service. I always find that. That tells me. So there's a question from James Thompson with respect to the public use system, and I think you did address this in this last answer, but you might have more to say. What do you see as the goal of the power structure over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I think we're looking at it. There's this professor who's been making the public and private circuits. His name is Galloway, Professor Galloway from the NYU Stern School of Business, and he's all over the place. And I think he articulates the vision of at least the sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. I think there's like different constituencies that want to privatize the university in different kinds of ways, and they all kind of meet in the middle, but they all have different agendas. So from the Silicon Valley perspective, they see the university as a place where, basically consumers get a high value technical product they pay a lot of money for, right? And the university basically is a kind of slush fund, and it's really the kind of the view. It's sort of, and I know Obamacare is under threat, but I think it's actually, you could say, the sort of Obamacare version of higher education, that basically you have an entirely privatized system where you have a lot of subsidies that basically help fund private industry, right? And I think that's their view. And actually, this was explained to me by the head of procurement at IU. Actually, my first year, it was very cute. Some English majors wanted to get Chick-fil-A off of campus. Most of the English majors, for whatever reason, and it's funny because we actually don't have anyone who explicitly does. We have kind of algae queer theory, but no one explicitly. We don't have an actual queer theorist in our department. But for some reason, I think like 9 out of 10 of our English majors are queer, which is great. Anyways, I love that they keep finding us, but I'm always like, I don't know if we can serve you properly. But in any case, they got a lot of our students got organized to throw Chick-fil-A off campus. This Chick-fil-A, of course, is this incredibly homophobic company. And we thought it would be this very simple thing. It's like, this is a little kiosk, that sells like, whatever, maybe 50 sandwiches at most a day. It's not like Chick-fil-A is making like huge amounts of money off of this. And so they had some protests, and we met with I remember I was the faculty kind of liaison from the students to the administration. And we thought this would be a very simple meeting. Fine, get some other like corporate scumbag, put them in their place, everyone's happy. Get, I don't know, Starbucks or whatever, some other sandwich maker, Burger King, just something that's not explicitly homophobic, or racist. And like, we're not asking for the moon here. And the head of procurement sort of, came all the way from Bloomington up to us and said, look, we really can't do that, because once you open the idea that students can have power over who's on or off campus, what private business is on or off campus, then we lose control. And you understand, the university appropriation for IU is $400 million a year, and that is $400 million we want to give to private business. And we want to, basically make sure that private business has access to as essentially captive consumer markets. And so once, and we can't promise that to Chick-fil-A or Zoom or whoever. If the students have control over who gets on or off campus, the contracts will suddenly start seeming very iffy. And so they said, it may seem very small, but this is the little thread that will start being undone. So I think that's like the neoliberal version. And then of course you have the right-wing version, which wants to see everything from eugenicists to race scientists to creationists, et cetera, back on campus, and the funny part is they always talk about, there's Shakespeare isn't taught on campus, but whenever we ask for, okay, fine, give us another early modernist, they never seem to want to give us another early modernist. So I don't think they're very serious with the Shakespeare business, but they're very serious about getting, these kind of quacks, wackos, right-wingers, laissez-faire economists, et cetera, on campus. So I think that's, and I think they kind of meet in the middle about this question of privatization, because as Jasmine suggested, once you privatize the university, then it gives administrators much more power to basically invite whoever they want, and they can get, Koch brothers has an unlimited amounts of money, and so the administration can get, okay, fine, we'll give you your person who says climate change doesn't exist. And in exchange, you'll fund our, I don't know, student activity center, or something like that. And I think a lot of administrators have bought into this model. Like, this is the only game in town. So sure, we'll shake down the Kochs for some money, and we'll give something, for students. And actually, a lot of my colleagues seem to think this way. That the game is over, and this is all we can do. We can basically just get a better deal. And again, it's sort of like the privatized model for public housing too is another example of this. A lot of activist organizations want to get community benefit agreements. So, okay, well, fine, we'll get this big private development, we'll get a community benefit agreement out of it. And I think a lot of my colleagues and administrators look at it the same way. Okay, fine, Kochs will bring in $1 gajillion and they'll get their wacko, and we'll get our early modernists because we'll shake them down for a little bit of money, and I really want to, push back against that vision. I don't think the vision is actually to close us down. I think there's too much money to be basically shoveled back to private industry. And actually, I think that's why the University of Vermont was successful at not actually having their universities restored. Is actually the University of Vermont administration said, fine, we'll call your bluff and just shut us. Fine, you give us such a big budget cut, we could either spread the pain out, as we always do, or just threaten to shut down, 3 out of 4 campuses. And once that threat was on the table, the legislators said, oh no, we can't do that. And actually there's a proposal, I remember when I was actually at UC San Diego, something very similar. The budget cut was large enough so you could have basically shut down the entire Irvine campus. And so one proposal was, well, fine, just shut down Irvine, and everyone said, no, we don't want to do that, because again, this game is too good, so yeah.
Benjamin.
I will pop in just to add one point of clarity.
Please, yeah.
That it's not actually just about funding student centers. It's much more impactful than that. It's like educating the judiciary. It's pulling out like policy and legislation that has disproportionate impacts on, structurally vulnerable, populations made vulnerable by structural oppression. So it's not just like, oh, you get a student house. It's, oh, you get a whole state and federal judiciary that is reflective of Koch network's motivations and ideology.
Thanks, Jasmine. We have some, Benjamin, I'm hoping you have a few more moments because
Oh,
there's some
absolutely,
very
absolutely,
interesting questions on the slate here, and Jasmine's point is well taken. They are,
Yeah, I also want to directly respond to Jasmine's very quickly, just a clarifying point. So I teach at a four-year public college, and so some of what I'm saying is actually rather specific to the four-year public college network. So and so yeah, we don't have. We're a nice little liberal arts, publicly funded liberal arts college, and I think we do a great job. But we're not getting a future Antonin Scalia's coming through our master's program. So yeah. So some of the so Jasmine is absolutely correct. But some of the things that I'm saying are I think specific to the kind of institution that I work for, rather than say, for instance, what's happening at Purdue or Harvard or Berkeley.
GMU, or perhaps here at the University of Arizona with the Freedom Center. Yes, and in those places, as Jasmine pointed out, they are definitely building their ladders into policy, the judiciary, the lobbyist groups, the law groups. We have another question. This is a yes or no question. This is, will the slides be available to us? Great presentation.
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. We have a question from
I should make one note though, and I don't know. So when I was the little thing I wrote for the DSA magazine, Democratic Left, I wanted to use the picture of Marcuse and Davis, and the editor said that may or may not be under copyright, and it probably will cost money, and blah blah blah. And so I don't care, but if that's an issue, that's why I might have.
We can remove that picture.
Yeah. Okay.
But we can describe it. This is from Dorothy Willis, and I'll read her question. I'm an activist in the California Faculty Association, the CSU Faculty Union. We are very worried about the current budget cuts and the threats of furlough. As you said, management loves it when they have a tight budget. They always use that to enhance their power. With COVID and the recession, not to mention the political atmosphere, we are afraid both faculty and students will want to be me first, and will be difficult to organize. Your ideas?
Whew, anyways, nice meeting a CSU CFA comrade. Yes. Actually, when I was organizing these budget cut protests, helping as a grad student in 2008, we worked with a lot of the CFA interns, and they were fantastic. So and CFA was very helpful. Yeah, I mean. I guess what I would say is that just my own experience organizing is that it's been harder on some level to organize because we can't meet in person, but people are pretty keyed up. I mean, we have the faculty on my campus are not the most politically militant, and so, but we really had meetings that were very well attended. Since COVID has started, because I think everyone knows that we're in crisis, and so we actually very successfully pushed back in our administration, who I think did want to push back in the classroom, and we actually ended up, working with them to actually try to create online programs that actually attract students, and I think the students are also, like I said, I mean, we're in a moment of both great repression and austerity, but also a moment of great upsurge in activism. And so I don't know, again, what students are doing at CSU, but I think there's a lot of space right now to push back on the idea of reasserting the public. And I think one of the things that has really made this quite clear is that the public university, one of the sort of thought experiments, like if we actually were public universities, we could have just closed down really for the pandemic, put everyone on furlough, told the students, we'll come back when it's safe and give you can be in the classroom if you want. We maybe run some small online programs. But I think that we can really, this is actually a moment that I think is very helpful to explain why exactly a privatized university is bad for everybody. You know, it's not just bad for the poorest of the poor. It's not just bad for people who've always gotten the short end of the stick. It's really bad for everybody up and down the line. And that's actually been an easier thing to sell. And so, and I think again, like, you know, I think people are ready to hear the message that a robust, functional public sector, you know, is important. I would say one thing to caution is that the Democrats have really, and I know that, you know, this is an important election year, and I think all of us probably want to see Trump gone very badly. But it has to be said, the Democrats have really not been a friend of public education, and particularly higher education. And I think one of the big fights that we're going to have is in the Democratic Party. And so, you know, and I think the thing that distressed me again around the Bernie Sanders campaign, I was like, well, you know, support Sanders or not, but you do know that, you know, this is to my colleagues and to people who have been suffering on the job market as would-be academics or as students who are crushed under student loan debt. And I was like, you know, support whatever you want, but you do know this is the only candidate right now who actually has a proposal for public higher education, and it just wasn't really on people's radar, you know. And I was very surprised to think about that people didn't really associate the cuts to higher education as a political question, right? And that we have to think about it as a political question that is both inside larger structural issues like funding for prisons, but it is also a political question inside the makeup and constituency of the Democratic Party. And then unless we can actually bring this to the Democratic Party, and I'm not trying to make a call for Sanders, but we have to bring this inside the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party hates us. Like there's no room there, right? You know, and so, but I have to bring this into the Democratic Party as a site of contest. And so I think it's going to be something where, yeah, we're going to have to, you know, basically do sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, we're going to have to work with our, you know, administrators to the extent that we can, where we can. We're going to have to engage in street protest where and when we can. We're going to have to, you know, unionize where and when we can. But we're also have to bring the fight and acknowledge this political fight. Like the Democratic Party, you know, like California has been run by Democrats, you know, for the last 20 years, and they're as happy to cut higher education as you know, the Tea Party in Indiana. And actually, ironically, Indiana's been run by the Tea Party, you know, for the last 10 years, and they've actually cut us less than some of the states that are run by Democrats. And I say that with nothing but hatred and animosity for 70% of my state legislature, you know. So these people are jerks about every issue, including higher education. But yeah, so I know that's partisan statements may not be welcome, but I think we're going to have to understand this is going to be, we're going to have to be, you know, low and dirty about this, in the sense that this is actually a political question, like political in the question of a party. And I actually one last thing, as I keep rambling on. So I'm a member of DSA, and even in DSA, this is actually a question that's really not on people's minds very much. And it's not understood as a working class issue. It's not understood as an issue of racial justice. And so even just like getting this piece in DSA was to some degree exceptional. And I remember actually the conversation I had with the editor. It's like, yes, we need to explain to a bunch of socialists why public higher education is good for people. And I think a lot of even people, members of the DSA, were surprised that Bernie was making such a big deal about this, because they didn't really understand how this fit with things that make much more sense for a socialist project, like, you know, a living wage or Medicare for all, or ending the, you know, carceral state, defunding prisons, defunding the police even. And I'm always trying to make the argument, yes, all those things are absolutely central, but the university needs to be central to that fight. So whether you're a DSA member, whether you like Bernie Sanders, whatever, I think we're going to think of the university as central to this fight for social justice, and really bring this to people who are our allies, who are not used to thinking about this, you know. So that's my pitch.
Two more questions, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is right up your alley, and actually right up the hot issue here at the University of Arizona too. It's a hot issue here. How likely is there to be a spread of unionization of faculty and staff Um, how likely is it to spread across Arizona, ASU and NAU, and to campuses across the country? And will that help in getting more funding from state legislatures?
Yeah, I can't speak to Arizona, so maybe somebody here who's in Arizona can speak to that
Yes.
if they want to. But I will say that the only the two groups that seem to be able to make the most headway on this question of public funding and also kind of ending privatization have been student mobilizations and faculty unions. And I think one thing I'll say is that in places where there's student mobilizations only and no faculty unions, the mobilization is much less effective. And the reason is actually fairly simple, is that students are great at hitting the streets and bringing rambunctiousness, and they're absolutely necessary. Faculty are not going to start burning, maybe they should, but faculty are probably not going to start burning tires in the street in the way the students did at UCLA. They're probably not going to be occupying buildings and chaining themselves to walls. They probably should, but they're probably not. But the one thing that faculty unions have is institutional presence. We're around for a long time, and having an institutional presence is very necessary to keep the movements basically going, and stable. And also translating student demands into policy, right? And like I said, students are great at a lot of things, but they don't have much experience, talking to legislators or hammering out policy demands. And that's something obviously they need to learn how to do. And so I'm not saying that faculty should just go off and do it on their own. But faculty can play an important role in those fights. Whether or not faculty want to do that, and whether or not they're capable of doing that, whether they can organize their own unions, is an open question. But there has been a rise in adjunct unions, and adjuncts are starting to get good contracts and translating adjuncts into lecturers. And of course, Rutgers has been this really great example of actually working with students to fight cuts. And they've been really, really careful about always having students on the agenda and working together. And I think that's the other thing is also one of the things that faculty need to do is really demystify the university. A lot of students have no idea what the working conditions of their faculty are, and absolutely faculty are very uncomfortable frequently being political in this way with their students. And this is part of faculty. Sorry, this is just kind of an aside, but part of faculty culture. Faculty are very good at politicizing a lot of things, but they're very uncomfortable politicizing themselves, talking about working conditions that they actually experience, and some of it I think is just shame. It's not fear, it's actually shame. I remember one of my colleagues, when I mentioned, who calculated her wages at $3 an hour, she's like, I don't want my students to know how little I make because it would be embarrassing, and I think even with my own colleagues who have tenure, they would feel ashamed to actually go out and protest over these kinds of issues. And I was like, you gotta lose the shame, So one of the things that's been really shocking is coming from a campus that had a faculty union and actually had a TA union, going to a campus with neither. So the grad students are not unionized on my campus, and the faculty, we have an AAUP chapter, but we don't have a union, and the culture is just very different. So building that culture is going to be very important. I've been working on it again for the last decade on my campus, and I don't have any surefire solutions, but I know being ashamed is not one of them. So
interesting. I know here at the University of Arizona, the union is being organized with the CWA, and it's across quite a few boundaries: adjunct, staff, faculty, tenured. And we'll have information to share about that. This last question, they're not rolling in. We're down to the last question here. And that is, locally, if you look at the first news story of President Robbins, our university president in Tucson, it was about him using Mitch McConnell's PR firm. And this was, I believe, in regards to the acquisition of the online company that had such a horrible reputation and was so exploitive in its history. If you look at that firm, 2 or 3 of its partners are Koch minions. I know that the Kochs are not your bailiwick, but we wonder, what that connection means.
Maybe do you want to talk about it? Because I don't. Like I said, beyond a very general sense of how these kind of private foundations can work, I don't know much about many of them specifically because, again, the kind of privatization on my campus works in a slightly different way. So I don't know, Jasmine, do you want to speak to this or?
Sure. So, I mean, in most cases, what we see are Koch-funded professors that have some sort of deep roots in producing research that informs our policymakers and legislators. And it's always skewed toward deregulation of corporate. It's always skewed toward tightening criminalization, surveillance, um, and like the carceral realities of Black and Brown communities. And so, I would be happy to take the names of the professors and do like a deep dive and pull all the data for you, because we've documented it for years and years and years across multiple databases. I didn't catch the names of the folks that could you repeat those, Jeff?
Well, we didn't have them in the question here, but 2 or 3 of the partners in Mitch McConnell's PR firm are embedded with the Kochs. And
Oh.
I believe this was in regard to the acquisition of Ashford University and the scandal that blew up around that.
Yeah, I mean, DeVos are close friends. Like the DeVos family is
Yeah.
close friends with the Koch. So it's just more of like whether it's corporate Democrats or it's folks on the right who are embedded with like the lobbying efforts that the Kochs put out through all of their multiple shadow donations and work. It's all a part of the same like ecosystem. And like even just recently we looked and reviewed all of the national leaders in the US Chamber of Commerce, which US Chamber of Commerce's tax code is a 501c6, which is supposed to be a social good entity for our well-being, but every single one of them have been on Koch's payroll at some point. And so they're using the US Chamber of Commerce again to represent corporations who Citizens United told us were actual people just like we're people, instead of we the people. So it's not, I have folks go, okay, Jasmine, tinfoil hat with all of this like red string and relationship, but it's all the same thing. Like even during your presentation, when you mentioned the PAL memo, that was a formative document for Kochs and their theory of change around how they leverage and capture certain institutions. So
Absolutely. Folks, we've come to the end of the Q&A, and the last questioner says she will send you information on that, Jasmine. We want to thank Benjamin Balthaser for his time and expertise and a very fascinating presentation that he has given us, and we hope to work with him in the future. Thank you, Benjamin, very much. You can support our work. You can donate to Kochs Off Campus here at this site. You can join us in our meetings or volunteer with us. This is actually a very interesting site to visit to get information about the Freedom Center and the Koch network activity here at the University of Arizona. There is a wealth of information here to explore and to educate yourself. So we do hope you visit the site and learn more. And we're very happy that you attended the webinar, and we hope to see you for future webinars and events coming up soon. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you very much.